This is Krista. Welcome back to Made to Be Whole. Stay tuned for this week's episode on nutritional and genomic insights into ADD.
Made to Be Whole is intended for informational purposes only. It's not intended to replace the advice or care of a licensed healthcare professional. Participating in this podcast does not constitute a provider-patient relationship with Krista Michener, AHP Integrative Health, or any of the guests featured on Made to Be Whole. Krista Michener, AHP Integrative Health, and any featured guests aren't responsible for any losses, damages, or liabilities that may arise from use of information obtained in this podcast or associated materials. Please consult a healthcare professional for any health-related concerns that you are experiencing.
Welcome back. So by request, we're going to speak about ADD or ADHD today. We first need to define it. ADD is Attention Deficit Disorder, and then there's the subset of Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. So you can have ADD with or without hyperactivity. There are a couple of core elements. So being distractible is kind of a core defining feature of ADD. Impulsivity is a defining factor, and inattention is obviously a defining factor. So when you're looking at that impulsivity element, that doesn't necessarily mean dangerous impulsivity, but just that act before thinking. You think it and it happens before you've had a chance to think through consequences. Inattention, just difficulty paying attention to anything, even things that may be interesting to you. Now, some people with ADD have the ability to hyper-focus on certain things. I see a trend in people self-diagnosing, and they'll say, well, I have a hard time paying attention to things that don't interest me. I don't think that's always part of a disease process. It just might be that you're not interested in something. But if it really interferes with your ability to work, to have relationships, those sorts of things, that's where you want to look a little more closely. And some people may be more heavily inclined toward one leg or another of that triad. And then with ADHD, you add the hyperactivity. So there's an excellent book called Driven to Distraction, which I think is a really clear overview. It was written by a physician who realized learning about ADD in medical school that, oh, I might have that. And it has become his career. He has a really neat little checklist in there. When I read it, I think there were about 100 questions on the checklist going through saying, is it possible you have ADD? And I think the last one was you had trouble making it through this list, which I thought was pretty funny. His name is Edward Hallowell. The book is co-written by John Ratey, R-A-T-E-Y, but it's very practical. It's an easy read if you're trying to understand more about yourself or child or a family member or a student or a coworker. I think it's a really digestible, friendly read. One thing that I think is really important is to sort out ADD from other things that can mimic ADD, because there are a lot of overlapping symptoms. So just because you have a symptom of something doesn't mean you necessarily meet the criteria for that disorder. So things that can mimic ADD include OCD, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, post-traumatic stress disorder. I've mentioned before we have a son who adopted with foster care. He came to us with an ADD diagnosis and was on stimulants. But it became really clear to me after not very long that the reason he couldn't pay attention is because he didn't feel safe. He had been in 10 placements while in foster care. The last place he had been sent, he was institutionalized for a year, and we found out that there was ongoing sexual abuse. And so when he would sit down, if he would sit down, because there was a lot of not sitting down. It was always turning. Your back had to be faced a certain way. He was always on the lookout for what bad person might be coming to do something bad to him. And I don't think pathologizing that is good. And stimulants were not beneficial to him. When I got him off stimulants, he was less agitated, less angry, and grew almost a foot. So he is not someone who benefited from that diagnosis. With medication, we'll get into it a little more when we dig into the genomics, but it's also important to recognize that sometimes response to medication can be an indication of whether or not it's an appropriate diagnosis. So when somebody tells me, for example, with anxiety or depression, that they've been on all the SSRIs and nothing helps, that tells me two different things. First of all, it's not a serotonin problem. It's not a matter of inventing another SSRI. And on top of that, it might be something else driving it that's more physiological. So the definition of insanity, is doing the same thing again and again, expecting different results. You might have something that's been labeled as ADD and you keep doing ADD type treatments without good results. It might be time to, first of all, step back and say, is that an appropriate diagnosis? I know that ADD is overdiagnosed, but I also know that it's real. That there are people who struggle mightily, and when they get proper treatment, their careers improve, their relationships improve, other things improve. You need to evaluate if somebody is having trouble with inattention, impulsivity, hyperactivity. Is there something else going on that might be driving that? So when you're at the school is just interested kind of in the behavior there. But you have to look at the home situation to see if that's contributing. If there's someone who's getting improper nutrition, if there's somebody who's not getting enough sleep, if there is abuse in the home, if they're seeing their mother be abused, all of those sorts of things, that's certainly going to make it more difficult to pay attention and to sit still and to not be impulsive. Ritalin doesn't fix your financial security. So even though it's more convenient to give someone a medication and the label, it's not best practice to jump for that. So I want to talk a little bit about nutritional risk factors for ADD. I think it's really, really interesting. I've talked quite extensively about micronutrient testing. There is a blog article that SpectraCell has called The Role of Micronutrient Deficiencies in Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. So, again, is it possible that somebody who's struggling might have some underlying deficiencies that fixing those could either resolve the disorder or at least improve things? So, some of the things that tend to show up more in patients with ADD, one of them is vitamin B6. So B6, you need to take the activated form of it, which is P5P, but there is evidence that high dose supplementation of B6 in the appropriate individuals can be as effective as Ritalin for some patients. Some people think that it's because of its role in helping with serotonin synthesis. It may be different from person to person. So low maternal folate levels during pregnancy has been linked to hyperactivity in children. So if you go back to the history of prenatal vitamins and the March of Dimes, folate is a big, big deal. Folate deficiency is what drives spina bifida. It's one of the main reasons that they want everyone on a good prenatal. However, we've spoken before about how not all folic acid is created equal. There are people who need methylfolate, if particularly they have that famous MTHFR mutation. Some people benefit more from folinic acid, which can more easily cross the blood-brain barrier in vulnerable individuals. This is one of the places that genetic testing comes in and is super cool. If you're looking for a prenatal or a B complex that has folate in it, I would look for one that has multiple forms of folate. That way your bases are covered. We've talked about Enbrace, Enbrace, or Enlyte, Enlyte. Same medication, different labels. Enbrace is actually marketed as a prenatal. Light has been marketed for major depression, anxiety, and ADD. But they have clinical studies showing that it can help symptoms of ADD. And it used to be just a small gel tab that you swallowed, but it's now available as a chewable gummy, which is cool for kids or people who have trouble swallowing pills. The full dose, if you are big enough as a child, is 2 gummies. Younger kids may just need one. That's based on weight, and your provider can help with guidance on that. So, again, investing in quality supplements is a big deal. Just going and grabbing a prenatal Off the shelf of your pharmacy is certainly better than nothing, but the more I dig into this, the more I think investing in some place that has really quality ingredients, quality control, etc., is excellent. Magnesium deficiency is also linked to poor functioning of the neurotransmitters that control emotions, social reactions, hyperactivity, and attention. Magnesium works synergistically with the B6 that we mentioned before. So even in the regular nutrient labs that can be ordered from your LabCorp, Quest, whatever local lab you use, you can check for magnesium, zinc, folate, and a few other things, both the plasma levels and the red blood cell level, for they're looking for an intracellular level on those. And that's something, if you have someone who's willing, that you can do to help you identify your status. Just remember though, because you are not deficient in a particular nutrient does not mean that you have sufficient levels. And if you have substandard levels, they're technically normal, but in that bottom quartile or half of levels, it's probably not enough, especially if you have symptoms. So those reference ranges, it's really helpful to have someone help you sort through those. Zinc, which I mentioned you can also get an intracellular level for, is also important because zinc is a cofactor for dopamine synthesis. Dopamine levels affect mood and concentration. So getting your zinc taken care of is good. Little caveat for that though, when you take zinc, if you're taking high amounts of zinc, it can deplete your copper levels. Copper is important for neurological function. So again, I think you're better off having someone test your levels, monitor them, making sure that all of these are being taken into consideration when you're making decisions about what to treat. Another thing that can affect ADD is carnitine, which is an amino acid. Carnitine supplementation has been shown in some studies to reduce hyperactivity, improve social behavior. It affects fatty acid metabolism, and it also has a really important role in mitochondrial function. Mitochondrial function is that cellular energy. So your carnitine and its role in synthesizing fatty acids is also important because being low on some of your omegas can also be a risk factor for this presentation. Another amino acid, if you're looking at those particularly, is serine. Serine, typically when you're taking it as a supplement, you want something called phosphatidylserine, that form of it. And when you take your phosphatidylserine with omega-3s, there seems to be some synergy. So again, instead of running out and saying, oh, I had ADD, I'm going to try a bottle of this and a bottle of that, very, very quickly, you can burn through the money that it would take just to do a good intracellular nutrient test. Now, an amino acid panel can also be run through your regular reference lab. It typically is just used because it can be an indication of certain genetic metabolic problems. I find it interesting from a nutritional standpoint. The only thing that I would warn you about is first, if you do the amino acid panel through your Quest, LabCorp, etc., you want it to be run fasting because within 12 hours, any proteins that you eat will affect those. The other thing is it's a lot to unpack. There's a lot of amino acids there, and you can get super, super overwhelmed. There are some clear-cut amino acid deficiencies that make it easy to interpret. Sometimes you have levels that are high, which is potentially a problem depending on which ones are high and how high they are. But generally, what you're doing is fairly nuanced. It takes me quite a bit of time to comb through these and say, okay, where are they? Yes, they're in the normal range for serine, but they have symptoms of ADD and they're in that bottom quartile of what's considered the normal range. That's not optimal. Other things that are really, really important would be glutamate and glutamine. Those are very important for neurotransmitter production, calming. Glutamine's a precursor for GABA. So again, a lot of different pieces of the puzzle that I don't think you're going to enjoy trying to bite it all off yourself. But my point is, nutrients can play a role. If you can figure out if there are nutrient deficiencies that you can address, you're going to be much, much happier. And even if you decide, we did all this, but I think I or my child still does better in school when they take the medication, that's totally fine, but you'll probably need a lower dose of the medication if you still need it. And you'll also know that you're protecting against other future issues that could come to pass because of an unaddressed deficiency. And again, why do we have all of these deficiencies? We live in a different world. Most of us aren't eating food that came straight from the farm. Our soil is depleted of micronutrients. We have a lot more processed food. Our farming techniques, I don't think we need to be paranoid, but I think we need to be aware there's a lot of things, or there are a lot of things working against us and working against optimal nutrition. So you do your best with eating good food, whole food, trying to avoid excess processed foods. However, I have yet to meet a person who had an absolutely perfect micronutrient test. There's always something. And if there's only one or two things, that's still great. That's still completely worth it because that's an easy fix. And if there are 5 or 10 things, that's okay too. We just start with one or two things at a time. We say what's foundational, what is most likely to be contributing to what you are concerned about, and then we build from there. So there are in the genomic testing, and when I refer to genomic testing in this podcast, I am almost always referring to Intellict's DNA because it's an excellent scientific tool that not only does accurate testing of these portions of the genome, it links me with research to know how to address that. So, unless otherwise indicated, when I say genomic testing, I am a provider. I'm relying on Intellict. There are some other tests that are sometimes covered in insurance that can help you figure out drug pathways. So, specifically, GeneSight and Genomind are frequently, not always, covered by insurance. GeneSight, I do know that Medicaid will always pay for in Ohio, at least. And it does identify if you have the MTHFR mutation, which is really good. Most of what it's doing is looking at pathways that have to do with drug metabolism so that you can identify which medications to avoid, how to dose them. There's a few other insights. It can be a useful tool, but it doesn't give us necessarily information about why you've been diagnosed with ADD or anxiety or depression or schizophrenia in the first place. So that's where the genomic testing from Intellict is very, very helpful. So part of their mental wellness panel includes an attention and focus panel. I'm going to read through some of the genes there. I know that some of this is like Greek, but my point is not to make you an expert on the human genome. It's just to help you understand how some of these genes might affect or drive the symptoms that you or a family member are experiencing. So cadherin 13, decreased remodeling of the brain. So basically, when somebody has one or more variants of this CDH13 gene, they have a decreased ability to remodel or break down old cell-to-cell connections in the memory center of the brain. So that makes it harder to learn new things. If you can't break down those old connections and create new ones effectively, school's going to be rough. Work's going to be a struggle. You're not going to like certain activities that might be delightful for someone who's not struggling with that. So then we have contactin associated protein like 2. I love these names. They're quite a mouthful. But when you have variants in that gene, you might have problems with auditory and speech processing. Contactin is highly expressed in GABA. GABA is that calming neurotransmitter. So GABA releasing brain cells. So when you have this, not only are you going to have struggles with auditory and speech processing, you're also more vulnerable to hyperactivity. So that could explain why one person has that presentation and another one doesn't. And again, there are a lot of really cool interventions based in research like acetylcholine. L-theanine can also increase GABA receptors, but the benefit of doing a test like this is being able to see which interventions are going to cover the most things. So, for example, I love neurofeedback. You've heard me talk about it before, but neurofeedback can increase connectivity. So, someone who has this variant, neurofeedback would even be a better option for helping their ADD. Other genes we look at, adhesion G, protein coupled receptor L3, also a mouthful. But people who have that variant, they have lower activity in the hippocampus and other areas of the brain. That correlates with increased impulsivity, hyperactiveness, and social memory. So, social memory, remembering people's names and faces and what's appropriate in one situation versus another situation. Again, the answer to this isn't, oh, I'm doomed. It's look at my genes. It's, okay, what does the research tell us? Acetylcholine is another good intervention for this one. L-glutamine is a good intervention. For someone has this particular variant, they might actually respond well to stimulants like Ritalin and Adderall and related things. Those aren't going to be the best intervention for everyone. You have dopamine beta hydroxylase and you have dopamine beta hydroxylase A and T, different ones. But if you have those variants, you're prone to lower levels of norepinephrine. Norepinephrine helps us with attention and concentration and controlling our behavior, that impulsivity piece of the triad. And on the converse side, you've got low norepinephrine and higher dopamine, when dopamine is driving that impulsivity even more because you want that reward. You're always moving, trying to get the next rush. So if you've got these gene variants, that's certainly going to present. And so if you have, I think this is interesting, if you have the DBHA, dopamine beta hydroxylase A, and dopamine beta hydroxylase T, that there is a 15 times increased risk of ADHD. 15 times, that's super significant statistically. So before we beat these kids up for not being able to sit still and pay attention and being all over the place and blame their parents for everything, and before parents tear their hair out because they just can't get this kid to sit still, 15 times, that's a big fat deal. Again, that's a kid that we really want to make sure their copper levels are adequate because it's a copper dependent enzyme. Zinc is a cofactor there. That, though, we want to do with testing and guidance. There are strains of probiotics and other nutrients that can help with norepinephrine levels. Exercise is really important for these people because it upregulates norepinephrine production and downregulates the dopamine receptor, so it helps bring things in balance. Exercise is great for everyone, but for some people it's super critical, and that would be one of those groups of people. The solute carrier family 6 also contributes to higher dopamine. Anchor and repeat and kinase domain containing 1, higher dopamine, and poor dopamine feedback regulation. So basically, they can't regulate that dopamine pathway. It's not just the production of the neurotransmitter, but it's the whole pathway, the receptors and everything, because dopamine affects not just mood, but motor control, impulsivity, motivation, reward. And I think it's interesting going through my own family's labs. We have quite a few of these high dopamine, low norepinephrine presentations, and I have one kiddo who has that, who has been diagnosed with ADD and completely fits the profile. But then some of us, we are just super anxious, I being one, like don't have enough norepinephrine, and I have a lot of anxiety because I'm on a constant dopamine high, and so I'm trying to get out of that fight or flight. So you can have some of the same drivers, but not identical presentations. CompT is one of the more famous SNPs. People who dab in genetics or listen to other podcasts have probably heard of CompT, which is catechol O methyltransferase. So there are different associations with learning. So when you have this variant, it can take 3 to 4 times as long to break down adrenaline. So think of your adrenaline rush. So you've got high adrenaline, norepinephrine, and dopamine. So if you have multiple copies of that variant, so you can have one copy of a gene variant or two copies, because each gene has two pairs, you could have higher levels of all three of these brain chemicals, and you're going to have a lot harder being flexible. This is the inflexible genotype. You're going to have a harder time with teamwork. You're going to be more anxious. You're going to be more like kind of aggressive at your baseline. We, of course, make choices about our behavior, but you're going to be wired a little differently and have to work a little harder. So, COMT is a big, big deal. Increased risk of ADHD, particularly in males, if you have the AA allele. Some of the things you can do for that include ashwagandha, magnesium glycinate. Now, interesting thing, we just talked about genes where we say, hey, if this is what you have going on, a stimulant might actually be a really good idea. But if you've got COMT, you're less likely to respond well to stimulants because you already have high levels of norepinephrine. And so they have data based on reports teachers have made that the people who did a good job with stimulants had different genes. So they did some studies where they had the information about the genome, and then they've got reports based on how people are doing at school. Also, quercetin, which is a really cool thing, is not a good fit for someone who has two copies of COMT. So again, I've heard some people say, oh, quercetin, it's bad. You shouldn't take it because it can cause X. It depends on who you are. Quercetin can be amazing for some conditions, but if you've got double copies of COMT, then you should avoid quercetin. Um, Monoamine oxidase A, lower norepinephrine, and lower dopamine levels have been found in people who have two copies of that. And then if you hop on over down the list, you've got 5-hydroxytryptamine receptor 1B, higher glutamate. So you may have remembered me saying before, glutamate is excitatory and agitating. Higher dopamine, which is that you're on edge, you're looking for that dopamine, high dopamine rush, and lower GABA. But it's because of serotonin dysregulation. So all of these neurotransmitters are produced and used along some really, really complex pathways. It's not just here's a teaspoon of baking soda, I'm throwing it in the cookies. There's just so many different ways they interact with each other. So L-theanine can be good and acetylcysteine can be good. Again, you're wanting to put everything together. Now, people who have higher levels of this are going to have not just less of a response to an SSRI like Paxil or Prozac, but they might even have reduced attention and memory with SSRIs. They're more likely to have those side effects with this gene variant. And I bring that up because even though SSRIs aren't typically used for ADD, there is often overlap in people having comorbidities. You know, somebody who has ADD, based on what we said, it's not hard to see how they might also be anxious or depressed, but throwing an SSRI on that person is not a good idea. You have your MTRR gene, the 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate homocysteine methyltransferase reductase. Say that 5 times real fast. But you're going to have lower methionine and higher homocysteine levels contributes to ADHD. This person needs to really, really make sure they've got adequate B12 and methylfolate. You have other genes that affect neurotransmitter production and nitric oxide regulation, like your GCH1 gene. This one is really important. I've mentioned it before because I've seen it help patients with a vast, vast, vast variety of conditions, because basically it relates to the production of a cofactor called BH4, which is tetrahydrobiopterin. You have to have tetrahydrobiopterin to make norepinephrine, dopamine, and serotonin, as well as nitric oxide and some other things. But those neurotransmitters are really going to affect your ADD presentation. If you've got 2 copies of this gene, you're not going to be able to make this stuff no matter what you do. No matter how much Prozac you take, your serotonin levels aren't going to be high enough. So starting with a low dose of PH4 tetrahydrobiopterin is an excellent, excellent intervention that can be absolutely life-changing for people. We have other genes that affect myelination, which is that nice fatty coating on your nerves that help your nerves. It helps protect your nerves and helps them communicate with each other. So if you've got two variants of this particularly, which one of my kiddos does, you're going to have more severe inattentiveness because it's a protective pathway. So acetylcholine, you may hear choline. If you're paying attention, I've said it probably at least 4 times so far, can be really important for brain health. You can also have neurotrophin 3, which is a nerve growth factor that helps the nerves basically grow and communicate with each other to form these synapses that allow them to talk to each other. And then finally, you have fatty acid desaturase 2, which when you have that variant, it's needed to convert plant-based omega-3s to EPA. And if you have a particular variant here, you're going to have lower omega-3 levels. And both EPA and DHA omega-3 fatty acids are needed for healthy brain cell membranes and neurotransmitter signaling. So that's a whole bunch of stuff. I'm not even hitting everything that's in their panel, but I'm pretty sure you're probably hearing the Charlie Brown teacher at this point. Blah, 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 blah. So I won't hit them all. But what I want you to hear from this is that there are a lot of factors that can contribute to the presentation of ADD. If you've been diagnosed and you've got interventions that are working great and you're living your best life, fantastic. If you're not living your best life and it's a struggle, why not find out why? Why not look to see, are you deficient in any of these key nutrients? Can we figure out which genetic predisposition is driving it so we can make better choices as far as medication and lifestyle interventions and help get you on the path to healing and optimal brain and body function. Remember to have hope because you were made to be whole.
Have a podcast question or suggestion? Text or call us on the podcast info line at 330-439-0686. Thank you for spending time with me today. If you like what you hear, please subscribe to be notified when new episodes release. And remember, you were made to be whole.